So I'm Hilary, as you just heard. There's my Twitter handle. So yeah, like you just heard, I come from the data science world. I have a PhD in biostatistics from Hopkins, but after that I moved into industry, worked at Etsy for a long time. I'm sort of bringing up my background because a lot of this will play into my talk later. So I worked at Etsy for a few years and really enjoyed my time there, really learned a lot. After that, I moved to Stitch Fix, which has just been an amazing place to work, super fun. If you care about fashion, you should totally come work with us. And I also have a podcast called Not So Standard Deviations that you should totally check out. And finally, I'm really appreciative that this conference was very open to R people. So I'm definitely in the R world primarily, and I'm a founding member of this R Cat Ladies hashtag. So if you're ever using R and you have a cat and your cat's like on your computer, please take a photo and tag it R Cat Ladies and we'll all like it. So guaranteed likes. Cool. So the idea with this talk is so this is a tweet from, I guess, almost 2 years ago now. And at the time, I had spent all summer working, going to conferences and hearing a lot about package development. So like R package development. I don't know how many people here would have gone to use R ever. It's okay, so we're definitely not an R crowd here. And so yeah, use R is, it's kind of an unfortunately named conference because you think it's about using R, but it's really more about developing R. And so, a lot of the core developers are there, and then package developers. And it's a great conference to go to if you want to know exactly what's happening and what new packages to check out. But I also walked away that there was also some stat conferences, et cetera, and I walked away sort of feeling like, we're missing the community effort around doing analysis, actually using these packages. And so we've come a long way, obviously, in 2 years, where now we're at this conference. Our studio also just had their first conference this year, and so I think there is a growing recognition that the people using the software should have their own community and sort of conferences focused around it. But 2 years ago, that wasn't the case. And the way that I was thinking about this was less about what conferences to create and more about what word should we even call this? The idea of writing a really good analysis didn't really have a word. And so I replied to myself, and I said, yeah, what about analysis developer? Any other ideas? And so I obviously stuck with analysis developer, but I want to take the opportunity to shoot down every other idea that came up in this interaction. So there was sort of oh, is this different than a data scientist? And how many people here hate the word data scientist? Anyone? Me? Yeah. I'm not, I've come around a little bit in that we call scientists, you'll call someone a scientist and it's oh, what type of scientist? And so I feel data scientist, there needs to be oh, well, what type of data scientist? It's the idea of applying the scientific method to industry, essentially. But yeah, I found this to be an unsatisfactory response because this term is just ridiculously overused to describe so much stuff. And so this is one of the first Google results when you Googled data scientist, and it's this woman who knows all of math and statistics. It's kind of hard to see, but it's just listing off all the sort of statistical principles you need to know. She also has all of the programming and database knowledge, so she understands how the data is stored and how to optimize and streaming data and everything. And then she also has all the domain knowledge, so totally understands the application, can sell it to business partners with no problem. And then finally, she's really great at communication too. So nowhere in this list is it actually writing good analyses and understanding the code for it. So I figured this term wasn't gonna help at all. So someone else replied, what about a reproducible researcher? Which I think is a good, it's in the right vein of what I was thinking about. But my problem with this is that reproducible is only kind of one of the adjectives that we have for good data analysis. And I actually feel for the most part, they kind of fall into 3 different adjectives. Like you want analyses to be reproducible, you also want them to be accurate, and then finally, something that doesn't get much airtime is that you want them to be collaborative. So especially in the industry setting, you might have other people who need to contribute. You might be delivering it to stakeholders, and you want them to be able to write questions. And so that's I think, a really important, an important factor. So then Hadley Wickham comes in with like his star power, and he's like, what about data analysis engineer? And for this, I felt like the difference between a data analysis developer and a data analysis engineer isn't really like that big. So I kind of liken this, like he like persists in not liking data analysis developer. And so I feel like I'm kind of like Gretchen trying to make fetch happen. And he's like Regina George, just like totally shooting it down. And he's definitely a mean girl, so it's like it all works out. But I'm persisting in trying to make fetch happen. So. And I really feel like, I don't know, we talk about software developers and software engineers, and I feel like we can talk about analysis developers or analysis engineers, and like, if we go with both, like, that's fine with me. The reason I like developer is that I just feel like it captures the process really well, like you're developing this artifact. And I like the idea, I had to get a cat photo in here. So this is like my cat going from, a cute little kitten to like this like majestic creature. And so I like the idea of like something coming together and like becoming mature. So like developing analysis is like getting it more robust and more mature. And then I like the fact that you can think about multiple things you're developing. So, I think traditionally when we talk about developing kind of like a analysis or developing an argument, there's a lot around narrative. And I actually feel like most of data science training is very focused on narrative. And so when I'm talking about narrative, what I mean are things like, what models are you going to use? Like, the assumptions in the model and the results of the model are going to be like key things you're pointing to convince people of things. There's also just like the argument you're going to make. I mean, I think how many people here do feel like they do data analysis as their career? Is it like a fair number? So like this idea of like creating, you figure out what story you want to tell and like the points you're going to emphasize, and you run through a bunch of graphs and realize like, oh, that's the interesting one, so I'm going to really focus on that. So yeah, like the argument comes together during that exploratory data analysis phase. And then yeah, just like the whole like, how are you going to convince your audience? You would obviously write a really different analysis for your CEO than you would write for like your other data science colleagues. You would use different language and make different graphs and make different points. So I don't want to focus on that at all. What I do want to focus on is developing this, like what I'm calling a technical artifact. And by that, I mean anything from like an email or a slide deck, or a PDF with like a longer analysis, or a GitHub repo with a Jupyter notebook like embedded in it. But just like whatever it is, the physical thing that is going to deliver your insights and your narrative to the people. And so the questions here are things like, oh, what tools are you going to use to make this deliverable? And like what coding and technical choices are you going to use for like producing this deliverable? And of all those adjectives, like which ones do you want to check off? And so talking earlier about my podcast, I've talked about this concept kind of a lot on my podcast, and my co-host took it a step further, which I really loved, where he kind of was talking about how mastering the statistical tooling and getting really good at creating these documents, these technical artifacts, is very much like kind of mastering a musical instrument, where you learn how to play the violin correctly and where all the notes are and how to make certain sounds. And the statistical theory is sort of analogous to the musical theory, where there's like certain patterns work really well. There's certain ways of like creating dissonance and then having it all come together that create like a pleasing sound for the human ear. And then the full analysis is really this piece of music. So there's still a ton of flexibility for creativity, even when you're abiding by all the theory or maybe breaking some theory in really principled ways, and you've mastered the tooling, but there's still this huge creative space out there. And so that's sort of like the spirit of defining these two processes as different, is that we want the technical part to not get in the way of like composing your symphony. All right, so back to the tweets. So there was all those replies of like different titles, and then this guy Carl came in, and Carl's like a dear friend. Carl came in and he was like, how about a good analyst, with a winky face? And a bunch of people liked it. And so I've given this talk a few times, and I perpetually am like, Carl's a great guy, he's really, really nice. If you email him and ask him a question, he'll send you back like pages of notes. So I'm throwing him under the bus, but he's actually a good person. I'm sure he didn't mean to kind of like make people feel bad. But I do think kind of phrasing this as like, oh, doing all this stuff is just like to be good at your job, because then the opposite of that is that you're like a bad analyst. So like if you create an analysis that's not reproducible, you're bad at your job. And I'm sure a lot of people, you know, this stuff is not easy, right? Like we're all at a conference because we like care about it and we work on it. And so kind of like telling people that they're bad at their job because they haven't mastered like all of the different things you need in order to create these complex documents that we don't even talk about, like probably a lot of people would feel bad at the end of the day. I don't think any of us probably feel like we write perfect, reproducible, collaborative, you know, accurate analyses every time we write one. So anyway, back to my idea, which was the right one. There's sort of this like analysis developer. And actually, Gabe Becker, who did not reply to any of this, but talked to me afterwards, made a really compelling point, which is that it's less about like the person's title, because then some people are that way and some people aren't. And so I think it's really more about like the process and defining the process and saying, you know, like when you're doing analysis development, here are some principles that you should be abiding by. So I was a little bit wrong there. Okay, so like why do I care about this and why am I talking about this? This is probably one of the less technical talks that you're coming to today. And so the reason why is because I feel like right now we're sort of in a place where we're like yada, 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 like away the best part, where it's like when we like do analysis, we're not actually talking about what we're doing so much, and we'll instead talk about like the narrative aspects and you know, like the cool new model we're using, but it's pretty rare. I mean, it's getting better, but it's more rare that we actually talk about like, oh, I wanted to make this reproducible, and so I made these choices, and here's, you know, screenshots of what I did. And I come from the stat community and was trained in the stat community, and so the types of things that I would hear the most, like kind of the resistance to this, were ideas like, oh, I really don't want to limit creativity. Like I don't want to have to abide by all these rules because I want to be able to do whatever I want. And then also, I think that probably people probably said that as rationalization, but the actual reason was that they were embarrassed by their code and their personal process. And I think probably everyone here would feel a little hesitant before just like publishing everything they've ever written. So we all are embarrassed. And so, you know, that's a problem too. And I'm going to talk about sort of how I think we can get past that. So why does this all matter? The reason why is because I think it's really getting in the way of sharing best practices and codifying them as a community. And so as of now, I mean, even at this conference, like we talk about kind of known common solutions to problems when you're developing analysis. Or I guess so we have like known common problems, and then there's actually already kind of like solutions to those problems. And so when I talk about common problems, I made a big list, which you don't have to read. These slides are online, but there are things like, yeah, you can't rerun your analysis and get the same results. So like, you know, probably everyone's run into that once earlier in their career, and that's a very frustrating situation. There's also things like, yeah, you update your analysis and then you can't compare it to previous results. Or, you know, you are not, like your code isn't performing as expected, but you didn't notice. So like some function broke at some point and you didn't inspect it, and so you've been getting garbage results for a while. And so there's just like a whole list. I mean, I think everyone could sit down and write a list similar to this of like problems I've run into in the past when doing my work. And And I sort of actually grouped these into like problems with reproducibility. So things like, oh, you use an external library and that was updated, and so now you can't reproduce your results using the old library. Or with accuracy, things like, you change the logic of a function, but then over here you're not using the function, and so now you have different results between the two. And then the collaborative thing, like, two people want to combine their code, but they can't do it. You haven't set up sort of the pathways for that to happen. And so I'll go into some of these in more detail later. But like what I want to convey is that we have common problems that all of us have probably run into at some point. And we have potential solutions for them because all of us have solved it one way or another. And so how do we kind of codify those as a group? And so this is where I want to kind of take a left turn and start to talk about the operations world, and specifically like the DevOps world. How many people are familiar with DevOps as a principle? Okay, like everyone here. So the idea here is that, so this was like a big part of the job at Etsy. It was this big online marketplace. There's a ton of servers. The servers had to stay up. There's a lot of small transactions, so the servers going down lost us a lot of money. And so it was a very DevOps heavy culture. And the biggest part of that was this whole concept of human error, or essentially like human error doesn't exist, and just like blameless postmortems. How many people are familiar with blameless postmortems? Some. Okay, cool. Yeah. So the idea here is that this book is like represents a paradigm shift in how you think about errors when they happen. And the idea is to switch from blaming a person for an error, so saying like, oh, that was like user error, human error, which you hear all the time in the news. So it's a shift from doing that to blaming the process they were using. And the idea is that it's sort of you trust your employees, or you trust the people you're working with. And so you can make the assumption that when this person was doing their job, they did not intend to make an error. Like that was not what they set out to do that morning, because I'm sure their day is worse because they did make an error. And so if you assume the person had good intentions and was doing their job and didn't expect the error to happen, then you actually blame the process for failing that person. And so it's like, oh, that process was not, sufficient for this good intentioned person to get their job done. And it's sort of like a simple idea, but to me it was a huge paradigm shift, especially coming from academia. Definitely not a blameless culture there. And so anyway, yeah, I have an example. So since some of you don't know blameless postmortem, I have hopefully will be a funny example of sort of putting a blameless postmortem into life and kind of like solving process. And so this is around my CD collection growing up. How many people here had like seriously organized CD collections? Yeah, okay. It's because we're at a data conference. That's why that's happening. And so I had a lot of process around my CD collection, so much so that I actually wrote a college essay about it. And so it was for University of Chicago. They have like crazy questions, and so describe on it. I came up with the idea of like describing an idiosyncrasy. And so yeah, I start the essay with this like ridiculous statement of like, oh, right when final exams ended, I rushed home and like with a broad smile on my face, I did what I've been wanting to do all semester. I organized my CDs. Not a normal teenager. And so the reason this was important to me was because this is me and my brother traveling and like expressing how we feel when we're traveling very visually. So like we traveled a lot as kids, there's traveling, you get tired, right? And so the incident that occurred was that my brother lost his CD binder on an airplane. So he like left his CDs, lost the whole collection, and like if you remember in the like early 2000s, CDs were as expensive as they are now. So it was like a lot of money, especially for a teenager. So it was very, very upsetting, and I found this to be like a very difficult emotional experience. And so I was like determined to not have this happen to me because it was so traumatizing. And so and CD copying had just come out. And so I decided like, okay, well, in order to avoid this incident that just occurred, I am going to create copies of every single one of my CDs. And so that's like a reasonable solution. How many people did that with their CD collection? Anyone? Yes. Cool. Okay, so you're on board. So it's like I treated myself to like a little wavy CD tower, and I got all these binders, and I got the blank CDs, and I had a system. And actually, my brother was reminding me he even had a more detailed system where he would like put a little A and like, anyway. So it was a system that was going to solve this problem for me. And then naturally, like the system started to like fall apart, where it was like I'd planned for kind of a set number of CDs, and then of course I like quickly got too many CDs, and so I had like I describe it as like a little city of CD towers in the corner of my room, and then I had like all of these binders, you know, it was like multiple binders. And then I kind of go into like a weird fever dream that's like during final exams, I would have trouble, like if I bought an Ace of Base CD, I would have to like shuffle every CD over because they are like alphabetical. And so I would just be sitting on the floor like shuffling CDs. And then when I was doing that, I would like miscount, and I would shuffle one too far, and then I had to like go back. And so at one point, yeah, I go into this like fever dream state where I like run out and get index cards because I saw on When Harry Met Sally that like she used index cards to organize things. So like here are the index cards that had all of my CD titles like in alphabetical order. I'm not even sure how this actually helped, but it meant I could count things more easily. And just to show you the scene in When Harry Met Sally, it's like the big scene when Harry and Sally are more than friends, and he's like laying in bed, and he's like, you have all your videotapes alphabetized and on index cards. And she's just like, oh yeah, do you want to watch something? Like, that's a totally normal thing to do. So yeah, that was like Harry's moment of regret. It's like, it's this person. So anyway, okay, so that was like comical example, but I did actually follow a lot of like blameless postmortem, sort of like, I didn't spend any time focusing on my brother because I understood what it felt like to be tired on vacation. Instead, I focused on like the incident and what happened, and then I changed the system so that it would be basically impossible for me to lose those originals because they were just living in the CD tower city in my home. And I used outside resources by like consulting with When Harry Met Sally and deciding to use that. Like computers were around, so I don't know why I thought index cards were the right solution. And then finally, like I kind of made trade-offs, or in this case, I actually didn't make any trade-offs, but like now as an adult, I might be like, is this really necessary? Like maybe you don't need the index cards. But this is like, ideally when you run into a problem, this is sort of what happens. You change the whole system in order to make it better. And so a blameful process would have looked a lot more probably what your childhood actually looked like, where, you know, the parents are like, Alex, that's my brother's name, like, keep better track of your CDs next time, which definitely did happen, just to assure you. And so like translating that into, you know, the data analysis world, that would just be something like, hey, you need to check this analysis more carefully. So it's like advice that doesn't actually help, doesn't actually prevent errors, it just makes you feel kind of guilty and like you were bad at your job. And so that is like, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that it's like, hey, people need thick skin and like that, you know, but I just think it's, I feel like what I saw at Etsy was just the fact that you shouldn't assume that everyone needs thick skin. Like you should just build processes that make people feel encouraged to share mistakes. And so like I said, yeah, and this is very much kind of John Allspaw influence, the former CTO of Etsy. And he wrote a bunch of stuff about doing blameless postmortems, and like really his full-time job was like getting blameless postmortems like talked about and indoctrinated in the culture. And I thought he had some really great quotes. So this was my favorite one, where he was saying, you know, an engineer who thinks that they're going to be reprimanded is disincentivized to give details necessary to get an understanding of the mechanism, pathology, and operation of the failure. So like in my brother analogy, it's like he might have tried to hide from my parents that he lost the CDs. And I'm actually pretty sure he did, because he knew my dad was going to yell at him. And so it's like, I think that's like the central idea here is that, you know, we have this list of problems that we've all run into with analyses before. And you can think about it, like we kind of have had these like blameless postmortems kind of personally, where we have started to adopt things like using GitHub or creating scripts for analyses. So we've kind of done like mini blameless postmortems ourselves. And so we kind of are already at the point where we know how to address many of these problems. And I'll go through these in much more detail, but things like having code review, or having executable scripts, or having issue tracking. Come in. But so yeah. Anyway, I'll just let this person be really embarrassed and come in, or not. Sorry. So yeah, like the idea that we already have, like getting back on track, the idea that we already have, like at this conference we're talking about these ideas, right? And these are ideas that probably don't seem foreign. I'm not trying to act like in this talk I have anything new that I've developed to like do analysis perfectly. I just want us to talk about this more. And so I call these the opinions. And so this is sort of the opinion part of opinionated analysis development. And I'm going to go through them all. And sort of the idea here is that I think we shouldn't, we should be more explicit about the idea that we think these are best practices and that these are the right things to do. So the first one, I think this one's a no-brainer, especially at this conference. If we were at kind of like a BI conference, that might be different though. So the idea of having executable scripts for your analyses, and this addresses some of the problems of like, rerunning an analysis, being able to get the same results, getting other people to repeat it, and like being able to take an analysis and apply it to different data. So again, no concerns here. Define dependencies. I think this one is starting to get into territory where we don't all necessarily do it. And so when I talk about defined dependencies, there's kind of like external dependencies. So like having your libraries all like explicitly defined and shared. And so because if that is part of your dependency graph, right, the code that's being used externally, so if that gets updated, it can mess up your results. And then there's also just like the code chunks or the like cells, and just like saying like, hey, this cell depends on these other ones up here. That's something that I don't, how many people feel like they do that regularly? I don't either, so it's fine. But we all should. So the next one, this one is definitely not used a ton, but having watchers for change data and code. So like if you change code, but you don't re-execute it, you get some sort of like error message that's like, hey, these results are out of sync with the code. And the only tool that I think does that well is like make right now, like GNU make, and I don't think most people use that. Modular tested code, this is getting back into the territory of what we mostly do, so like writing functions. And so, yeah, like that solves the problem of being able to reuse logic in different parts of your analyses, and then like being able to like test those functions so that they're performing as expected, so having unit tests in the functions to make sure it's all working the way you want. Version control, I think, is like a pretty widely used practice, or at least you probably all feel like you should do it. And so the idea here, this will address concerns and like problems or errors, like you update your analysis and you want to compare it to the previous results. You want to point to code changes that like resulted in your different analysis. So you want to tell a collaborator like, here's what I changed and here's what it caused. And then it also addresses some of the collaboration issues. So like, being able to combine code is easiest when you're using GitHub or another version control system. This one I love, and I don't think many people do it yet. And I don't think the tooling's there to do it yet. And it's assertive testing of data, assumptions, and results. So like unit testing for your data. And this one I think is really interesting because if you have a reproducible script and you're like rerunning it every night for a dashboard, if the data drifts from some of the assumptions you made and checked originally, and you don't have proactive tests on it, then you can start to get pretty like bogus results. So it's like the one thing that actually gets worse with reproducibility, which is sort of interesting. So yeah, the idea with that is that the problems or the errors it will solve is like when your data becomes corrupted, you'll notice. And then if you have a new data set that renders your methods invalid, you'll notice that too. Code review. Actually, I'm super curious. How many people do code review for analyses? Nice, wow. Like all the time? Or like how, well, yeah, I'm curious. I would love to hear afterwards of like how to incentivize that within a team, because it's hard to do, right? It's a hard cultural shift to make. And so code review obviously helps you, especially with accuracy, where it's like you make a mistake and you didn't notice. Or you're using like super inefficient code and someone can say like, hey, don't use for loops in R, and you figure it out. And this one I feel like I put this as a fundamental opinion, even though I think most people wouldn't think this is a fundamental opinion, which is just like issue tracking and communication around progress and status. And I think it solves so many problems with collaboration, where you're talking about like, how do you communicate collaboration? Can your collaborators see where you're at? Can they make requests in like a way that doesn't totally disrupt and upset you? And yeah, just like it makes projects move smoothly. That's why it's like a fundamental part of GitHub. Okay, so I put this at the end of that section because I feel like it's a little bit of a slog getting through them. But I did want to spend time kind of like outlining exactly what I was thinking. So you might be wondering at this point like why I'm spending this talk talking about process so much, and why I think that's so important. And the reason why is because without good process, opinions can really become toxic very quickly. And it can create a toxic culture where you feel like people are kind of shoving their opinions down your throat. And the reason I know this is because I have a lot of experience being opinionated. And so I have a quote in here from a friend that was like, oh, I never fight with anyone else except for you, at his birthday party. So, I've thought a lot about kind of like the downside of being opinionated and feeling like you're right and wanting to help people do the right thing. And I think it comes from a good place, or at least I want to tell myself it comes from a good place, because like this is actually from John Oswald's earlier blog post talking about, a funny thing happens when engineers make mistakes and feel safe giving details. They not only want to be held accountable, they're also enthusiastic in helping like the rest of the company avoid the same error in the future. And they're the most expert in their error, and they ought to be heavily involved in coming up with remediation items. So I do think when you're opinionated and you're like telling people what to do, it most of the time is coming from a good place of like, hey, this is really helpful for me and I want to help you. But the delivery of that's very important, and we live in an era where delivery mechanisms can be really toxic. So I have here, you kind of like combine the like, well, actually attitude, like, well, actually, you should be using GitHub, with Twitter, which I describe as it's a platform designed for miscommunication. And then you're kind of like really into a coding choice. So like I am like an R person, and so it's like you like bust in and you're like, you should be using, well, actually, you should be using R. And that is like recipe for a complete standstill. How many people have experienced this? Yeah, excellent. Okay, some enthusiasm. I'll be the first to admit that this was me for much of my 20s. And so, like, just some like simple examples. You should be using GitHub. Like, I'm sure like most people in here have uttered that phrase once or twice. And so like, yeah, in my like reframing, a helpful coworker would say something like, oh, if this is a project where you want to compare results, so focus on the problem it's solving. You might want to use a version control, so then focus on the opinion, not the software choice. And then like GitHub's good, RStudio integrates with GitHub, like you can put Jupyter notebooks on GitHub, et cetera. Like there's ways to sort of tease apart the points. And so then that really starts a conversation where the person would say, oh, I do care about version control. I can't use GitHub for these reasons, but maybe I'll use GitLab, something like that. This one I just put in for the cheap joke, saying something like Excel is the worst. Again, I feel like probably everyone in here has said that before. And so again, to make this a productive conversation with your business partners, you might want to say something more like, oh, Excel makes it hard to create scripts. And if you want to redo this analysis and not have to, re-merge cells and move things over and whatever, writing a script will take more time now, but then it'll save you a lot of time later. And so it's just like shifting from this I know better than you to lots of people have run into this problem, including me, and here is the solution and software that makes that solution easy. And so I thought a lot about this and like, should we really call this opinionated? Like, that's kind of a loaded term. I don't think most people have positive associations when they hear that word. But the reason why is because opinionated software is a thing. So this idea of software that believes that a certain way of doing things is right, and you should provide software, like a certain process is right, and you should be providing software that encourages that process. And the creator, kind of like the first, from what I understand, one of the first opinionated software things, one of the first opinionated softwares was Ruby on Rails. And so that creator had this great quote talking about, it's a strong disagreement with conventional wisdom that everything should be configurable, that the framework should be impartial and objective. In my mind, that's the same as saying that everything should be equally hard. And I super agree with that. And I'll sort of say my like edgy, I think that both RStudio and Jupyter could like up their opinionated game a little and like implement processes a little bit more. Like in the absence of that, there are a lot of good like plugins or R packages that introduce some more structure and kind of push you in the right direction. So I sort of, this whole like talk is based on me finding the project template R package years ago and just how much that changed the way I work. There's also, I think, Cookie Cutter for Python for my colleagues. I hear that that's like a pretty good one also that implements similar process in Python. And then I know that Beaker X, there's a presentation on that earlier. It sounded like also sort of an opinionated framework for IPython or for Jupyter notebooks. And then at Stitch Fix, we have Notebook, which is also similar, sort of implementing some of these opinions on like a plugin for Jupyter notebooks. And so, yeah, like the reason I care so much about having opinionated analysis software is because if you've ever had to use unopinionated software or like even worse, software with like the wrong opinions, it can be really frustrating. And I definitely had that experience in a former job where a very well-intentioned engineer sort of created this thing that was sort of stapled on top of something else. And I just remember sitting in the meeting and being like, having this like, this is bullying. Like there are rules to this. Like you can't just create any software and think that it's good because it doesn't fail. And so yeah, it's like we can start being like, well, this is analysis, there are rules, or this is analysis development, there are rules, if you're like really on board with me. So yeah, so just to like recap what I was talking about, I think we really need to define this process, and I'm saying that it should be analysis development. You can call it analysis engineering if you're pro-Gretchen or pro-Regina. I think it's, along with that, it's really crucial to create and encourage a blameless culture. So make sure that it's never about blaming someone for doing something wrong. Frame the discussions around incidents rather than around software choices, and discuss the opinion. So discuss these like principles rather than the software itself. And then encourage software makers to create opinionated analysis software, which I'm trying to do now. So, so yeah, thanks. Thanks especially to Skipper Siebold, who's here, Jenny Bryan, Carl Broman, John McDonald, gave me a ton of feedback on this. And yeah, thanks. If any questions, I am up here. So thank you. There's people hovering. I'm not sure. Yeah, do we have time for questions?
I think, so we have a 10-minute break.
Oh, okay.
One thing I wanted to say is that just down the hall in Gramercy, I don't know how to say it, they're doing user testing for the Jupyter Lab project. So it's actually really cool. They have several of the core devs there, and they're just sitting you down and running you through how it is you typically interact with Jupyter Lab. So they have sign-up sheets for it. So you don't have to do it now, but I would suggest that you go sign up if you're at all interested in Jupyter Lab and helping out with getting feature requests or saying, hey, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. So they're open until, I think it's 8 o'clock tonight, and they're open from tomorrow from, I don't know, business hours, 9 to 5, something like that. So you can go over there, sign up, and then come back either to this session or another session to see the talk. So you have 10 minutes to do that.
Cool. Awesome. Wait, so should we do questions?
Yeah, well, I think we should do questions, but people
cool.
should feel free to walk out if they need to.
So this is, in some ways, a paradigm shift in how you approach analysis. Where do you see when
Yeah.
Is this more of company culture?
Yeah.
Training? Where and when do you see that as a good place to start?
It's a good question. I've definitely been trying to evangelize to like educators. I have friends in stat education still. And I mean, I do think company culture is probably realistically where this will be learned. And I was really inspired by learning more about the history of DevOps and the fact that it went through a similar shift, sort of only in industry, right? Because you don't really have like DevOps in academia. And I think that fundamentally this is being pushed by the tooling. So the fact that people are starting to write scripts and then all the complexities that come from there. The DevOps world went through that really similar shift where it went from, you have an operator and you have people who develop software and they're totally different to, oh, the operator is going to be writing the solutions themselves and needs to be thinking about solutions while they're writing it. So I think like it's like this has happened before, it will happen again. Like this is the same. Have you watched Battlestar? Yeah. So it's like, it's the same thing happening. And so I think it's a good question. I would love it if it was taught. I think realistically, companies that want like these full stack data scientists who implement solutions, that will be the driving force. So yeah, cool, yes.
Many of your opinions about data analyses seem very appealing, but it seems to me that a number of them, like say doing regular asserts on assumptions, are not so well supported by the tools in either the Python or the Spark ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure.
What is your take on that? Do you think it's reasonable to ask analysts to do these things today, or?
That's a really good question. It's kind of like chicken or egg, because once people do it, then people will start writing solutions for it to make it more efficient. And so, like absent of being able to just go with like feature requests to open source developers, which is like maybe not the best way to interact with open source developers, I think that probably hacking things together and doing it scrappy is like a forcing function for that. But that being said, I wouldn't, as a manager, I wouldn't want to like force everyone to do some super heavyweight thing either. And I actually think, I mean, now that I'm talking this through, I actually feel like it's most important to just to like let people know that there is like a right theoretical solution to this, even if the tooling's not there to do it. So like kind of what I was talking about with Make, where it's like there's just not really a solution that works in kind of an analyst first workflow, and you would have to be kind of like engineer-y to do it. And so so I feel like that's like the most important thing to me, is not like forcing people to do it, but just making sure that people know like there is a solution like that seems like a good idea. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
One of my opinions that you didn't mention was using provenance and provenance management systems through every decision and analysis that gets made.
Yeah.
So a lot of things you're talking about where your code changes, the data changes, or other pieces is captured in the W3C prov methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So something that like, and I've done it internally, but it's not something that every data scientist has to say why the decision was made.
Mm-hmm.
But something to add to that of like, if you actually have to say why your decision was made, who made it, who touched it, and what data got there.
Yeah.
The WC3 prov, and there are pretty good prov tools that will force a lot of this
Yeah.
methodology.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super open to the idea that there might already be, because it's like, again, these problems have been solved in like the DevOps world and probably the software engineering world, and I'm coming at it as an academic statistician turned data scientist, so I am not aware of like everything out there. I do caution that very frequently people assume that data scientists can do like lots of engineering stuff that may or may not actually be true, and so I would be interested in like knowing more, because I don't know anything about it and like how easy it would be to implement on like every data problem. So, yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
When should you write tests? Because I've had success people adopting most of this other stuff.
Yeah.
Code
Yeah.
use not so much. But test is like a real trade-off there, because
Yeah.
they take a long time, and they're not always that important. Like
Yeah.
you're just kind of doing an ad hoc request for somebody,
Right.
versus if you're building like a more complicated piece of logic that will be rerun.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think I can answer that. And I think the fact that you can frame it as like a trade-off is my goal of this, is that instead of people like yelling about like, you should be using this software because it has tests and tests are so important, it's like, oh, let's weigh the pros and cons for this concept, for this application, and know the trade-offs we're making, and potentially make tooling choices based on that. And like, I think that can be a really productive conversation, but so frequently it's just about the language. And it's actually like this weird argument about something over here, but it's coming out over there.
Like a values framework. Like, if you care about this, then consider this sort of solution.
Exactly, yeah. Cool. Okay.
Let's thank our speaker.
Yeah.